Hey, I'm Tim, and this is a way too long video. Talking about Shantae like in the title, but why am I singing now? Why did I do this? This song's way too high. Just please don't dislike this now. Please don't dislike. Just like. Wait, actually, is it Shantae? Shanti? Hold on.
Shantae and the Pirate's Curse.
Think I'm gonna need a little more clearance on that.
Shantae and the Pirate's Curse.
Almost got it.
Shantae and the Pirate's Curse.
Really close to getting it.
Shantae and the Pirate's Curse.
Really close to closely getting it. Okay.
Shantae and the Pirate's Curse.
Shantae and the Pirate's Curse, developed by WayForward Technologies, is an incredible game. Most notably because of how amazing the movement feels and controls. Pretty much all of the abilities you receive will give you more options for moving around in the game world. And once the player learns how to use multiple jumps, all the techniques start connecting and multiplying each other's effectiveness, allowing players to get creative in how they want to use what they have. First, there is the single jump. Then you can glide, and at some point Shantae can jump 3 times in the air, making stuff like this possible. Combine all these things with our hero's speed boost ability and suddenly you can also cover huge distances like so. This way every item is still useful at different points in the game or becomes even more useful later on. Or in other words, the longer you play or the more time you invest, the more fun and expressive the game's movement becomes. And while such statement clearly is a compliment, it does still pose a potential problem. Shantae and the Pirate's Curse, just like any other game out there, has to give the player a reason to invest all that time in the first place. Having an impressive endgame alone won't always make players experience it. If the rest of the game, especially the beginning, is lackluster, a lot of players will surely drop it before it quote-unquote gets good. Because no matter what cool stuff Shantae might be able to pull off in the beginning all she can do is jump once and attack, and that should be fun too. Oftentimes people will say it is the first hour that will make or break an experience with a game, and as a rule of thumb, I'm fine with this statement. The time frame of 60 minutes is obviously subject to change depending on factors such as the length and type of the game or how long it takes for a given player to lose interest. What has to hook the player is the beginning, the introduction, the first act. Simple as that. So how well does the game introduce itself and what is worth talking about in its very first moments, however long those might be? To better understand that, I will essentially be looking at the game's first stage ending with the corresponding boss. Now, a first level has to get an intimidating number of things right. After all, this following set of challenges will heavily influence the player's initial impression of the game. It has to be fun while at the same time easing players into potentially new game mechanics and skills they will later be asked to perform under more pressure. The emphasis here lies on ease, since when we are taught new things we want to ideally learn them on our own without having to be told what to do. The level, just like any other well-designed level, should be fair but also present a challenge. And it should also make you hungry for more, to name just a couple of design responsibilities. Examining how well the team dealt with some of these problems is going to be the goal for this video, so let's get into it. The game begins with a very quick cutscene showing us the looming threat we will obviously have to deal with later on in the game. A tombstone on a very scary looking island that wants to take over the world / Sequinland. Not very subtle or novel, but it fits the game's lighthearted atmosphere. And since this is an action platformer, there should not be too much urgency to produce a gripping narrative. What matters most is the gameplay. After the island scene, we switch focus to our protagonist Shantae, who is woken up by some sort of commotion outside her house. Through screen shaking, the sounds of cannonballs being shot, and Shantae saying Scuttle Town is being attacked, we find out that Scuttle Town is being attacked. So we, being the valiant half-genie heroes that we are, set out to put an end to it. After leaving the house is when we receive full control of Shantae's movement, meaning the player can launch into action after only about 60 seconds of introduction. Getting to the playing part of a game fast is always appreciated. Before going anywhere else though, I want to talk about this specific room. We have not been presented with a challenge yet. There's nothing to do here. All the game wants is for us to keep pressing on towards town. The screen I'm on right now is nothing but a transition between Shantae's interior and the action going down in town, but I can still freely move here. It would not have been surprising for a game to take control away from the player here and make our hero run to the right automatically, but it doesn't. So why do I care, I hear you ask? Well, if you've ever watched an analysis video of Mario 64, chances are you might have heard someone talk about how that game gives the player a very effective playground to fool around in when trying to figure out Mario's controls. Those were especially tricky back in the day because players were not used to 3D platformer games of the sort. Levels in that game are entered through portraits or other secret entrances spread throughout the fully explorable castle. This allowed the player to test out different movement mechanics. Learning to overcome the natural challenges the environment presented on the way to the actual levels was great training for the real deal. Thusly, the castle allows for a natural feeling introduction which the player can freely control the length of. Shantae and the Pirate's Curse does that here in a very simplified way. I mean, sure, what was a whole castle in Mario 64 turned into one small screen, but then again this game is also not as groundbreaking as the old Mario classic from the 90s was back in the day. On my very first playthrough I took some time here to try and better understand how the game's controls function. It's very easy to miss, but it is still nice to have the option to collect yourself for a moment before heading into the action, or you could just ignore it. Being able to go about playing and learning the game at your own pace is always nice, and doing so without a long tutorial text is even better. The first level properly begins after exiting this screen and reaching Scuttle Town. We are greeted by a huge crowd of citizens fleeing the city in fear, which the art and animation team did a great job of portraying. Apparently someone called the Ammo Baron is invading the city with his army. Scuttle Town itself has this nice oriental feel to it which contrasts nicely with the military theme the Ammo Baron, his goons and their weaponry bring with them. Makes them really feel like they don't belong, which, well, they don't. We also meet our friends Bolo and Sky, who we will receive both an auto potion and a pike ball from. Both items are fairly simple and help making the first steps a little easier on the player. The auto potion automatically revives the player as soon as Shantae's health reaches 0, health being indicated by the hearts in the top left corner of the screen. The pike ball item activates a single metal ball with pikes that tries its best to rotate around Shantae's body, which sometimes looks a little weird, but hey, at least he's trying his best. Spiky, that's my name for the ball by the way, hurts every enemy he hits and thusly can help if any of them get too close. Countless hours of playing this intro level made me fairly intimate with him. Because of being a spike ball, friends sometimes call him Spiky, which would make him a spiky pikey. And despite how he may look, he's actually quite the athlete who loves wearing a particular brand of shoes. On top of that, he's also the physically and mentally toughest in his family. So basically a mighty spiky pikey preferring to wear Nike with a strong psyche. So don't take him lightly. But since he's still such a small spike boy, he can protect a large area. Later in the game though, you can find a better version of the item where Pikey also invites his brothers in on the fun. That is when stuff gets lively. What follows after parting with Bolo and Sky is the first real gameplay section of the first stage. It is filled with one enemy type that looks like this. My first time playing the game I was very impressed with how the developers showed and explained this opponent's habits and other little things in a safe and easy way. The first bad guy to appear here was up on that rooftop right there. Even if we take our time running to the right, he will just be charging towards the left, pass us and not be a threat. It does however show the player that Shantae can jump on some of the environmental objects in the background, how the foes look, and that they simply run in one direction without stopping. As a side note, it's also great having enemies approach from and jump to different elevations like these do, since that way there's more for the player to keep track of. A lot of grounded enemy types and platformers always stay on the same platform they are on, which is true for a lot of foes in Shantae and the Pirate's Curse too. Introducing enemies for both movement patterns helps with variety and lets the designers add more varied challenges. Another example for that are Super Mario's Koopas. Green ones just walk off edges, whereas red ones turn around and march in the other direction. Unfortunately, after playing the stage a whole lot more for this video, I found out the enemy spawning here seems to be mostly random, and it was actually very rare for this exact sequence to happen. I'm going to touch on that soon, but first I want to mention another sort of similar experience from the level's next section. Here a new type of enemy is introduced. This man will throw what looks like a Molotov cocktail at you from way up there on the roof. On my first playthrough, when I didn't know exactly what he was going to do, I just kept moving forward without fear, and to my surprise the timing of his attack was a little slow so that I was able to move past the threat without getting hit. He also only throws to one particular location in each direction, making me almost completely safe after passing it. With this I learned what the enemy is capable of doing and what I should look out for without me actually being in danger. So now to compare this with the first example. The timing here feels quite random too. It depends on how long you spend on the dialogue with the mayor and on the way to the throwing guy's position. In both instances, the one in the first section with the single enemy on the buildings and the one here in section 2, the RNG and timing just happened to work out in a way that felt like it was carefully designed to happen in that way. And while I do think it's cool to teach the player like this, a designer also has to keep in mind what is necessary for him to teach a player and what is not. There's no right or wrong because players are different. It's also safe to assume I would have figured out these details on my own not too long after, maybe only a couple of seconds later even. But maybe I would have taken damage for it, and it would have felt unfair. All I can say is that the built-in randomness in enemy spawns, for example, helps with selling the atmosphere of a town being invaded. It also adds variety if you happen to die and have to play through the stage again, which I did a lot for this video. These decisions do, however, take away from a possibly more streamlined, possibly safer learning process that could be helpful for some people. Finding a correct answer will depend on a lot of factors and the target audience you're trying to please. Reaching a conclusion was never my goal, though I do believe talking and thinking about such things can be an interesting and helpful exercise to further develop one's game design muscles. The rest of section 1 is fairly straightforward, with more buildings and more of the same type of enemy. Except for one small part where the player crosses a bridge and is attacked by these fellas right here. The first thing to notice is that they enter the fray in a different way than other enemies, showing us something else we have to be ready for when crossing bridges. They look exactly like all the other attackers, which tells us they will likely act similarly to the blue ones from before. After landing, they do what all the other ammo baron lackeys do, mindlessly charging towards the left side of the screen. Classic color coding also lets us assume these, since they are red, won't be simple run-of-the-mill enemies like the others from before, but at least be a little more dangerous in one way or another. Again, true. They take 2 hits to kill instead of the usual 1. This might not seem like a big deal, but it means the player can't just stand still, attack and expect to be safe, since they will still come at you after just one attack. One last thing to mention here is that when introducing a new type of bad guy, the designers chose a flat bridge as the environment of choice. Removing all the extra platforms and elevations helps the player focus on the new threat in order to make it easier for them to figure out how to deal with it. So now let's get back to talking about section 2. After throwing McThrowface, we can see a simple example of how to take an idea and make it more and more challenging each time it's used. Compared to the first variation of fighting this kind of enemy, where you could almost just walk straight through without getting hit, this might even seem like too big of a jump in difficulty. Here the player has to jump on a tiny platform that is now the target of the assault. The jump timing is a lot stricter, and after getting it right, you will also want to time your attack and space your jump just right in order to defeat him while avoiding taking damage. A clever way to make life easier for yourself here is to attack the enemy from the ground, because you can actually reach him with a well-timed jump and attack. Wish I realized that during my first playthrough of the level, or my second, or my third, or at least before my 15th or so. Next, a grey enemy type is thrown at the player that takes 3 hair whip attacks to kill. For their attack they fire 3 bullets. I'm not too happy with how they are introduced. See this right here? These are vases with shinies and hearts in them, so players are very likely to try and get them, which then is likely going to result in them taking a hit. I don't particularly like the design here. The vases could have instead been used to guide the players into an effective strategy to deal with the problem at hand. What I find interesting is that the game does exactly that a couple steps further down the level. Here the designers are indirectly controlling the player to help them kill the grey man. So how would one tackle the problem of an enemy that is shooting at you in a straight line? 2 solutions come to mind immediately. Going above or going under, which are unsurprisingly both present here. And what are the things players might gravitate towards first when being in this situation or any similar one? I would assume they would either defeat the enemies to advance and take the treasure safely, or go to the treasure directly. If players choose option 1, they will very likely start with the first threat they can reach, that being the blue dude on the platform. Doing so will likely make them end up on said platform where they will be safe from the other foe's shots. This will teach players to go above bullets and look out for useful elevations. From here the player can also easily reach the enemy with a single jump, so timing the approach according to the grey man's shooting habits shouldn't be too difficult. Going for the treasure first will result in an entirely different experience. The vases here are the very first ones that cannot be reached by means of a regular attack, because they are too low to the ground. Most players knowing this should need no more hints or explanations to figure out Shantae can crouch. This is a mechanic that has not yet been explained and was not important so far. Ideally, what happens now is that the player crouches down to reach the vases while the grey man is shooting, making the bullets go over Shantae's head. This way the player learns about crouching and one possible strategy to overcome the newest enemy's attack patterns. It's also worth it to note that players, even if they decide to kill the attackers first, will most likely still figure out there is a crouching mechanic soon after. Being able to indirectly control players like this is one of the most important skills a game designer should adopt. There's a whole lot more to say about indirect control, so if there's any interest in a video about the topic, I would be happy to oblige. I really love this, and I also love what follows at the beginning of the level's next section. It's a tower, and the first thing you see is this, a big tempting vase you can't reach. The trick here is to figure out you can crouch through a small passage right below the first staircase. The designers can be quite sure that at this point the player has learned about the mechanic in an organic way, making finding the secret doable. Running straight into the wall will automatically make Shantae crouch as a safety net though, for if the player does not have a clue of what to do here. Some players who made the connection might actually feel like this downplays their achievements, so as always, developers have to be careful making decisions. What follows is a satisfying reward in form of the game's first vase this big. So I think now is a good time to talk about this world's item containers. In them you can find 3 different types of things. Usable items, which I'm not going to showcase further, are one type. Then there are hearts, which will heal up 1/4 of one heart container. In the first section of the level, this is the only thing you can find in the vases. Like this, the player will be a little safer at the beginning. After that is when you start finding gems, the game's currency for the first time, in addition to the healing hearts. Gems in this game function much like Legend of Zelda rupees, in that there are multiple different kinds of rupees, or in this case gems, each worth different amounts. In the most recent Zelda title, The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, green rupees are worth 1 rupee, blue ones are worth 5, red ones are worth 20, and so on. Just like with some of the enemy types in Shantae and the Pirate's Curse, color coding items or monsters makes players more aware that there's a difference between whatever it is they're seeing, without the team having to create completely new graphics for every one of them. The gems in Shantae and the Pirate's Curse can be either purple, red, blue, yellow, or green, and are all worth the same amount. So here color is not what separates the values. This game differentiates specific values by changing the size of the gems. Small ones are worth 1 money and big ones are worth 5. Like this, it's still easy enough to tell them apart so as not to confuse players. In other words, since the scale of the gems differentiates them enough, the game designers are able to vary the gem colors, making finding them much more interesting and fun. It's like you're opening a treasure chest or a hidden pouch filled with the most beautiful rubies, sapphires, emeralds, amethysts, and topazes. It feels very fitting considering the game's Arabian theme. I also think it's a good idea for them to have chosen relatively small values for gems and not adding ones worth more than 5, because that way you can put lots of gems in one container, making destroying and getting them all the more satisfying. Another help here is the subtle yet effective sound effect when both shattering a vase and subsequently when collecting gems. All of this combined makes destroying the item containers and watching the differently colored treats pop out such a great reward for the player. Big vases, like I already mentioned, are especially fun to break, for they are filled with a ton of shinies. Now back to the small tower, which I consider to be the start of the third major section of the level. This here is where the player gets more familiar with fighting on slopes and how enemies act on them. It's also the first time we move through a level vertically instead of horizontally, but apart from that there is not too much stuff worth analyzing here. At the top is where we leave the tower's interior and get to the meat of section 3. We are greeted by another blue enemy, only this time he is wielding some kind of automated machine gun. What most players will likely notice first are the red aiming points. Red as a color indicates danger. The designers are using aiming points to indicate something, and also there is a guy with a huge gun. All of that combined should ensure the player will put 2 and 2 together and realize it might be for the best to not get overly close. Again, indirect control. This time it happens through a maybe not so subtle visual hint. But making it very obvious might just be the perfect choice in a situation such as this, because after all, most important is for the player to understand the information. There can be a certain fear, players will scoff at this type of design, feeling like it undermines their intelligence, which, needless to say, is not something we want to evoke. In his book The Art of Game Design's chapter on indirect control, Jesse Schell talks about visual design as a method of tempting players to do certain things. He also gives an example I find to be quite fitting here as well. Their team was trying in vain to make players take a certain path to a specific point in a room that was free to explore. Exploring was meant to be done only after getting to this point, but people didn't bite. To solve this problem, the team added a single red line to the floor that led directly to the goal. Nothing in the game actively mentioned the line or told the player to follow it, but they did instinctively, like a moth flying into the flame. And even more interesting, in an interview afterwards, most players would claim to not remember seeing the red line at all, even though it was very easily visible. This makes absolute sense to me. Psychology suggests we only take conscious note of about 10% of everything we experience at any given time. Now I guess the lesson here might just be that oftentimes clarity is more important than unnecessary subtlety. Don't be afraid to be too obvious. Show your players what's up. And while I'm at it, I figure I might as well talk about some of the other ways Shantae and the Pirate's Curse uses visual cues to help explain things and guide the player. One thing a team will always want to illustrate well is danger. After all, you wouldn't want someone feeling frustrated because of what they perceive to be an unfair death or hit. But the quality of how this is done can vary from game to game. Remember being at low health in either Legend of Zelda or Pokemon titles? If you've played some of those, you more than likely will because of the ever-present obtrusive beeping sound the games will alarm you with. Is it important to make players aware whenever they are close to losing? Probably. Is it necessary to keep reminding the player via a constant sound effect for as long as you remain at a low health total? Probably not. Does it give you a good reason to heal up, even if it's just to make the beeping stop? Most definitely yes. Way Forward is less annoying in this regard. Whenever Shantae is close to dying, her regular confident idle animation will be replaced by this beat up one. And it still helps convey the same information Zelda and Pokemon are trying to relay, while also giving the player good reasons to find healing items as quickly as possible. Another nice little detail can be found when looking at death pits. Some of you might have already noticed during earlier clips. In typical platformer fashion, there are numerous challenges involving pits you should not fall into, or you will lose health for it. In some games it doesn't become clear which pits are hurtful and which can arbitrarily be traversed in order to find hidden treasure or maybe even the next scrap of the main quest. Shantae and the Pirate's Curse does the player a great service by using small flying skulls and bones to indicate death. But weird visual choices can also be found in this game. Since it's a two-dimensional game with background, you can sometimes run into problems when it is not absolutely obvious what ledges and elevations are usable for gameplay and what are just cosmetics. One example can be found right here, or with the machine gun shooting guy from section 3 I was talking about. This to me definitely looked like you could attack him, but apparently he is actually a lot further away than one would think. Again, it's difficult to make stuff like this clear in a 2D game. So, now that I brought it back onto the level's rooftops with this brilliant transition, we can keep talking about this section of the game. When going through it, the player will find that there is nothing to actually hit here. All the challenges revolve around avoiding shots and platforming rather than fighting, allowing for a nice change of pace. Here the player is tested on dodging the mentioned machine gun attacks and maneuvering over cracked looking platforms. Giving them this broken look and feel to them seems like a tell indicating these might not be the safest. And this assumption proves to be correct when the tiles, much like in classic platformer tradition, disappear shortly after jumping on them once. Mario games, for example, use this idea for various kinds of platforms. This one falls after jumping on it, the donut blocks fall after being on them for a bit, and I'm sure there are other variations, especially in other platforming games. What I like about Way Forward's use of their disappearing platforms is how well their mechanics and art fit in with the theme of the level. The stage focuses strongly on heavy machinery and weapons, so they don't just fall, they're destroyed by rockets, with the cracked look adding believability. And since we are currently on the town's higher buildings' rooftops, we can easily imagine all the ammo baron's goons that must have set up the rocket launchers below us, and are now waiting for the perfect chance to shoot Shantae out of the sky. All this goes back to strengthening that feeling of a thrilling invasion. The launching rocket's presence and where they will detonate is announced by the same red aiming points from before, abusing the player's experience with them to announce a similar danger again. The platforms just suddenly vanishing could be a problem when timing jumps, but since the player clearly sees the, again, red missiles approach, there won't be any wondering about when and why the platforms will be gone. Used to introduce the mechanic is a single straight bridge. There are no gaps here, so the player can't fall through anywhere by misplacing a jump. And if you mess up and end up without platforms, you can always jump from one building to the other, because of the still relatively small distance between them. Some players might also not go onto any of the breakable platforms at all and just jump over the whole thing, which would still trigger the rockets, letting the player know exactly what to expect. So to summarize, another case of a nice and safe learning experience. After this is when the training wheels come off and the player has to make jumps with tighter timing windows and without any backups. The section as a whole is very similar to a classic level design structure commonly used in Mario games. When applied, developers introduce problem A and problem B separately while increasing the degree of difficulty as the level progresses, and then combine them in the end for a final challenge really testing the player's mastery. Mechanic A here is dodging the machine gun. It stays pretty much exactly the same each time the player encounters it. What changes is only what comes before and after it. Here are all the times the player has to deal with the challenge. The first one introduces the idea. The second one is the same but with a little less space to move around, and the last time the player is asked to solve the exact same problem again, but this time twice in a row. While the second variation with less usable room may add some spice, it still doesn't really feel like the idea is being thoroughly expanded. Especially the last instance feels like instead of making the mechanic more challenging, it's just asking the player to do more of the same thing. Mechanic B, the being shot by rockets while jumping around on platforms thing, is designed in a much more interesting way. Presenting the player with numerous platforms with different heights and lengths, and changing the size of the gaps in between adds some much appreciated variety. There's also one instance where the concept is used in a slightly different way. Here you can't go through, so you will actually want your attackers to blow up your footing. Unfortunately, there's not a lot to think about here since there's nowhere else to go, meaning the problem kind of solves itself. The idea also is never used again, which makes it feel like a waste of a perfectly good way of challenging the player to think differently about a situation. The last part of the level design pattern I referenced was putting both concepts together in a satisfying climax, which is nowhere to be found here either. At the most we get all the elements stringed together, but there's no real multiplication of mechanics. We do one thing and then we do the other, instead of having them enhance each other simultaneously. Everything I complained about here is not really all that impactful, especially since the section is very short. And there are many more ways of structuring challenges in a level I haven't touched on here, and none of them are necessarily inferior. The fact of the matter is just that I felt this stage of the level had some untapped potential and thought comparing the patterns used here with a very prominent one would allow me to explain why. Now that we've spent some time on top of Scuttle Town's buildings, it's time to go back down to where most of the action is happening. And what better way to do this in a video game than by using an elevator? Albeit a makeshift one that consists of a couple of long platforms Shantae can fall through, making us wonder how to advance. Well, I can hear ticking, and these two things under the platforms sort of look like bombs, so if games have taught us anything, we should all know what to expect now. The time bombs will explode, destroy a little bridge friend, I named him Kevin, and the player will fall down onto the next one to continue the cycle. Each floor will be the host for a slightly different challenge until we triumphantly reach the bottom of the tower. The quick transition from challenge to challenge and the explosions really support the level's theme of you fighting off this huge beweaponed army. Like this, Way Forward accomplishes a very different feeling experience compared to the slowly moving elevators of some other games. The slower style is not particularly worse, mind you, just, well, slower and less flashy, allowing for a more gradual realization befitting of different ideas, like the depicted theme from Rayman Legends and its underwater stealth mission theme, for example. So now let's talk about the actual problems the designers want the players to solve. It is fairly simple really. First there is this ninja guy, then there are 2, then 3, and then there are 4 ninjas. What may feel like the solution with least resistance does work quite well because of the way these enemies work. See them clinging onto the bottom of the platform there? That makes it impossible for the player to hit them, resulting in short survival sections lasting until the floor beneath Shantae blows up. First the player doesn't know what this foe will do, but that's fine. Getting too close to bad guys has never been a good idea in this game nor in most other platformers out there, so players will likely try avoiding it, which incidentally seems to be the best tactic to not get hit by them. The reason for that is that these ninjas only attack upwards and only do so when Shantae is directly above them. It also takes a bit of time before this attack is executed, meaning if players naturally back away when getting too close, they will probably not get hit and see what the enemy is capable of at the same time. So again, the game uses the player's instincts to help them learn about dangers in safe ways without just telling them. Even though this here might seem like another case of making the player do more of the same thing, I would argue making this already small space even more crowded with more threats can lead to a fun and tactic experience. The time during which this concept is used is again short enough to where the potential lack of variety wouldn't matter much anyways. Also, a nice little touch and probably one of my favorite moments from playing this game for the first time. The number of bodies might be somewhat of an exaggeration, but it obviously makes the scene even funnier. And look at those little convulsions, they're so adorable. And terribly hurt. This felt like such a great reward and some nice feedback, showing me the team was willing to go the extra mile to add a few details. And while we are talking about details, did anyone notice that we started this game on ground level, then went up a tower, fought on top of buildings' rooftops, and now went back down to ground level? Way forward, keeping up continuity while changing the scenery and the confinement of the level's themes? It's pretty good. So now that we've been through all that we've been through, we reach what is essentially the last real screen before the boss battle. Technically, there is still the safe room, but I'm not going to count that one. It's common wisdom that throughout the course of a well-designed stage, the level of challenge should be increased, much like tension in a story. At the end of all of this should stand the absolute height of tension, the climax. A satisfying conclusion befitting of all the preparation put in to even get there in the first place. And much like with the before mentioned game design structure of introducing A and B separately to combine them for a final challenge, the end of a level should incorporate all the ideas preceding it. The result will be a culmination of everything the players have learned and really test their skill in different yet fair ways. Unfortunately, it is here I think where the design falls a little flat. Almost literally flat even, for all the buildings in the background give the wrong impression. Although huge parts of the level and the rest of the game are spent platforming, there's nothing to jump on here. No change of elevation, it's all just pretty background. As a result, it already becomes so much harder to create interesting challenges. Look at the enemy placement for example. First there is a throwing guy we have fought before, not really dangerous. Then we are jumped by the same red enemy we are already used to. Next, the bridge beneath us gets blown away, much like the small platforms earlier. This is not really meant as a challenge, it just feels cool. We also can't go back anymore. Then there's another red enemy. This is followed directly by another blue foot soldier, and then we fight one last grey shooter with a couple of tiny vases in front. Much like my sentence structure just now, they are put one after another, instead of allowing them to enhance each other. Without variation, it becomes another case of making players do exactly the same thing they have already done, but in a somewhat more rapid succession. Like I said, they limited themselves when they decided not to use platforms. Couple this with the fact that there are no flying enemies in the game yet, and the option of using the Y-axis is completely out of the question. Now everything has to happen on the same plane. This means that when you want to add the available types of foes, you can only put them one after another, and suddenly the design feels flat and somewhat dry. There are a lot of ideas the designers could have reincorporated here to mix things up. Platforms definitely are the biggest one, because they can enable so much more. Look at the Molotov cocktail throwing guy for example. If he was placed closer to, say, another enemy on the ground, or there were simply more of him, we could have already had new things to think about. What if he was also a little higher up so we couldn't reach him by just jumping? You could then add a platform in between which the player would have to safely reach. The platform could also be protected by another projectile shooting enemy. We could have also had the machine gun guy somewhere in the back, or maybe have the ninjas creep around the bottom of the bridge to make stuff more interesting. Or what if there was a way to make it so the player has to move both horizontally and vertically here? This can be seen a little later in the game where a huge wall forces Shantae out of the predominantly vertical realm for a bit. A change of pace like that could have also allowed for enemies to be used differently. The same foe with its normal attack patterns can lead to very different challenges if the player has to go up instead of the right. We can clearly see this in this short section from earlier. Whereas we could normally just jump over the charging enemies, making them approach from the top and giving them slopes messes with our easy solution. It might be that I'm too adamant about the idea of having a huge final screen. Not all levels have to follow the same structure, and what we have here is just a tiny excerpt of a good first level and an excellent game. It's not even a bad excerpt, I only felt like it was more forgettable than it needed to be, like a watered down version of what came before it. Now, with everything else out of the way, we get to what everything has been leading up to. All the pain, the gain, the button mashing, the whip-like hair slashing, the tower climbing, the gemstone finding, the fear of explosions, the deer of erosions. Wait, I think I lost it. Maybe we can come back though. The genie adventure, the bikini drencher. Okay, nope. Alright, one more shot. The projectile dodging, the erectile lodging. Okay, never mind. Just forget about it. Anyways, here he is, this stage's boss, our last test, the Ammo Baron. So now that we've talked enough about him, let's skip ahead to the conclusion. Looking back, I found that while there were things I complained about, most of them were minor gripes and nothing super substantial. All the critique made comes from a place of love for the game and admiration for the designers. I don't know about others, but typically the more invested I am, the more critically I tend to think about something. Speaking of loving the game though, here's what impressed me the most. The Way Forward team is very good at directing and teaching players in safe environments, which is so important in making the game feel fair. Information is always conveyed without instructions, so that the player experiences a feeling of accomplishment when figuring something out. The gameplay feels smooth, is rewarding, and even though we are still fairly limited in what we can do, never boring. Sometimes the design of screens could have needed some more spice to make things more interesting, but the game never dwells on ideas for too long. It feels like you're going from food truck to food truck, trying a little bit of everything, instead of committing to one restaurant completely and eating a full course dinner. One choice focuses on variety and adventure, while the other rewards you with a single, carefully designed multi-layered experience. None of these alternatives are inherently superior. It all depends on execution and how well it fits a particular game. Another huge plus is that the designers managed to capture the clashing themes they were going for really well. The more modern military side of the attacking army and Shantae's time-worn oriental-feeling home Scuttle Town work great as opposing sides. Both art and sound design do a great job showing this appropriately too. Then there's also the lighthearted, even silly atmosphere and dialogue. It's clear Shantae and the Pirate's Curse is not taking itself too seriously, and that's extremely refreshing. The game is not deep or dark, there is no daunting undertone, it's just plain fun. And that might be the most fitting description I feel I can give for both the early and the late stages of the game. So, to bring it all back, the excellent movement options the player will acquire throughout might be the game's unique selling point, and most likely what will stick with players the most, but I do believe Shantae and the Pirate's Curse's intro stage pulls its own weight too. The game doesn't just get good, it is good. But hey, what about this? If you're not yet convinced, here are some last small details that can be easy to miss but rewarding to find. The mayor watching you and opening his mouth in awe when the player passes by. Shantae's landing stirring up a little dust cloud, coupled with a short sound effect creating a nice feeling of impact. Shantae making her hair. Shantae wiggling her butt while crouching. Shantae in a bathtub? Oh, I see, she doesn't actually have a bathtub. Wait, what?